you know, people like yourself spend a lot of their lives, large amounts. Sometimes it's estimated that young people today can expect to spend 4, 5, or even 6 decades in and out of the workforce, and a large portion of their waking hours working. So as such, it's no surprise that the work experiences that we have importantly shape who we are, how we think about ourselves, our aspirations, and how we view the world. The Work Science Center, as Dean Collar has said, highlights the science of working in order to better optimize the human experience and value of work for both people and organizations. The point of the lecture, the point of this series, a lecture series, is to share information with the behavioral that we have in behavioral sciences with other units, and to stimulate conversations across interdisciplinary boundaries. So, with respect to Dr. Ford's talk today, I think it's important to note that working experiences and the emotions that accompany them are often hot and personal. It's certainly been the case for me. I've had angry emotions about what I thought were unfair decisions made at work, emotions sometimes so strong that I missed my exit while driving home. If you know Atlanta, that's not good. I've had colleagues who made returning to work on Monday something that I really, truly looked forward to. And I've experienced help and support from people at work when I least expected it, leading me to feel gratitude, generosity, and a sense of belonging. The question is, are these moral emotions, and what are the antecedents and the consequences of their occurrence in the work setting? Today's speaker, Dr. Ford, will shed some scientific light on these questions in a way that may help us to understand how to better enhance rather than diminish employee lives. Please join me in a particularly warm welcome to Dr. Motley.
Okay, thanks for having me. Obviously, I'm grateful to be here, and I should also mention that I'm very fond of Georgia Tech. My advisor is Lois Tetrick, whose advisor is the late great Larry James, who was my academic grandfather, if you will. He was brilliant in terms of his contributions to organizational climate, psychometrics, and then later on implicit personality. So I just have a connection to this place, and I just wanted to mention that. So again, the talk today, I want to talk about, again, I call it moral organizational behavior. Basically, the things that happen at work that fall within the moral domain. And I'm going to focus on 3 things here. One, the relationship between these experiences and employee well-being. 2, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the emotions that people experience at work and often in everyday life, and that I think are driven fundamentally by moral considerations, even things that we wouldn't necessarily use that term for. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about the explanations that people come up with in their own minds for what's happening to them, how they attribute that to what they attribute that to. Do they attribute it to this characteristic of the organizational entity? Do they attribute it to individuals? Do they attribute it as something intentional or not? I'm going to start, though, by actually broadening this out, only because I think this is sort of gets at some of the things that I think would be interested to look at in the future, and I'll sort of come back to this briefly at the end. But trust in institutions is, in many institutions anyway, is in decline. In terms of big business, in terms of governments, I'll stay away from that topic otherwise, but generally the media, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of distrust in these sort of institutions. Scientists even, you get some people that don't trust scientists at large in general. And what is interesting about this is that, people, think about groups like this as entities. They think of them as like they're other human beings, and they use descriptions. And so, how many times have you ever heard something like this? My organization doesn't care about me, or my organization is greedy. All right. So what what does that mean? What are people referring to there? Is it the building doesn't, or is it the logo? Or no, obviously not. You know, they're thinking about something else, some sort of group level construct there that's driving these. And so people are assigning mental states to groups. And this is something I want to come back to a little bit at the end when I get to explanations that people come up with for morally relevant events. But I think this is a very interesting dynamic here, and it's central to one of the things I'm interested in here. So it implies a couple of things. One, that organizations have mental states. When people say things like this, whether they do or not, people think this way. It's like the old Gestalt psychology. You know, there aren't, you know, a dots in a circle aren't a circle. You know they're dots, but you can't help but see the circle. And I think this is sort of a more, complex application of that. The organization has intentions and goals. It's assuming that the organization is trying to do things. And it implies some kind of moral judgment, because these characteristics that people assign to their employers, these are relevant, especially when you're talking about whether the organization is trying to help or harm you, right? That's one of the most fundamental moral principles. And so I think this implies some moral judgment of the organization. So, morality in everyday life is central to daily experience. I think people experience things that fall within the moral domain regularly. In this, people hold because and also causing this, the fact that people hold groups and organizations to moral standards like they do other people. And so one of the things, again, that's very interesting to me is what are people referring to when they're judging an organization? Are they referring to the leader? Are they referring to practices? Are they referring to the principal owners? They're referring to the other employees? All those things. And I think that's an interesting question. So before we get into some more empirical stuff, we have to think about what is it that follows in the moral domain. I mean, you could argue about this, but there are at least a couple of theories that I think are pretty informative, at least it influenced me. Obviously, you could certainly discuss and have some debate about them, but this is what is driving at least some of the assumptions that I'm making. One is this moral foundations theory, and so this is a theory developed by Jonathan Haidt and Graham and then their colleagues. They have identified actually 5 basic principles, and they argue that when something occurs that falls within one of these categories, that it is no longer just a preference or a sort of autonomous behavior by somebody. Then there's some kind of standard of right and wrong in those cases. People have argued that this evolved because people, to allow for group living. That's not so important here, but these are the principles they identified. One is help and harm. So whenever somebody's helped or harmed, all right, this falls in the moral domain. All right, obviously one person harms somebody else. Generally, again, you can think of instances where this wouldn't be the case, maybe, but generally people say that's immoral. If you help somebody, it's commendable, right? Fairness and reciprocity is another one. So again, people should be treated fairly. Also, if somebody does something for you, if there's some felt obligation to do something in return. Respect for role relationships. So they were talking specifically about hierarchy, to some degree. I think more broadly about respecting other people's roles, respecting other people's dignity, and then loyalty. So to some degree, there's at least people do view that if somebody has helped them, and this relates to some degree to reciprocity, but it also involves group membership. When people are disloyal, this is seen as sort of moral violation. They also added purity in there. I'm not going to talk about that today because it doesn't factor into organizational life as much, but it is a topic that they discuss. The other thing that sort of drives my thinking is the sort of this dyadic approach to morality, and this is sort of a different camp, I suppose, from the moral psychology world, but I think they're not incompatible in what I'm looking at, and that's the idea that basically when people are morality is also activated typically when there is sort of one person acting on somebody else, whether it's being helpful, being fair, being respectful, being loyal or disloyal. So there's always this sort of actor, and then there's the recipient, right? So there's, the supervisor yells at an employee, the supervisor is the actor, the recipient's the employee, right? And so people develop emotions toward the actor. They also develop emotions like sympathy toward the person that's being acted on. And they argue that part of moral judgment is also this idea of mind perception, that people believe that there are mental states, that the person who's acting has some control over what they're doing. This is important if we start to think about people assigning moral judgment to an organization, because this assumes the organization is also acting in some way that involves some agency, and it also has sort of intentionality as well. And so that's something I'm sort of applying here. So if you think about this moral dyad, you get the organization, the agents here. You have the recipient, the employee. I suppose you could look at it the other way too, but I'm going to focus in this direction. You have all kinds of things that maybe fall into this category. All right, so the basic framework for it I'll come back to here. You have organizational practices, behavior. These include behavior by the agents of the organization, people acting on its behalf, leaders, people who work for the organization. 8 conditions of work, so the types of things that people do every day, their workload, the control they have. And then also sort of behavior of the organization at large, so decisions or practices that the organization has, maybe or maybe not attributable to any individual, like a policy of HR policy, for example. All of these things are sort of could potentially fall within the moral domain. These lead to beliefs and emotions toward the organization, right? And then these have implications for well-being and also trust and reciprocation. So this is the basic framework. And to tie this stuff together, I think moral principles play an important role in the extent to which the behavior and practices lead into beliefs and emotions that people have. I also am very interested, as I said at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the explanations that people come up with for why these things are happening. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to start, just briefly talk about a couple of papers looking at well-being as it relates to fair treatment in particular and related issues. So when we look at employee well-being, the traditional areas of emphasis have been really basically physical hazards. So if employees have dangerous work or things like particles in the air, stuff like that, all right, that's bad for your health, okay? And so of course we need to focus on those. OSHA was particularly focused on that initially. Then people also start to look at workload. All right, this is probably the number one stressor that usually people report, right, having too much work to do. And then also how much control they have. So when people don't have much control over the work, all right, this is also a very strong predictive stress. So what recent approaches have called attention to other things, and they're correlated with these, but I think they may actually be even more powerful. It's fairness, justice, equity, things that are related to this as well. And that's what we focus. And so one of the things I am interested in is why are these related to employee well-being fundamentally? So perceived fairness in an organizational context, this refers to there's 3 basic categories. Distributive fairness, so fairness in pay or other rewards that people have. This is all in the mind of the employee. Procedures, so the extent to which there's perceived to be a fair process through which decisions are made. Employees have voice in the organization. Is there an opportunity to correct decisions? And then finally, interactional or interpersonal. So are people treated with respect and dignity? Are they given information about what's happening to them? So, and a fourth one that we also consider here is what's called psychological contract violation. So this is when employees view that the organization has violated what they believe is owed to them, something that they're entitled to. And this triggers some anger. But anger is actually part of the construct, in fact, the way that it's assessed. So we did a review. We looked at the relationship between these variables and employee health and well-being. One of the things that is interesting is that these are really the 3 main categories of well-being that we looked at. One is physical health. Second, we looked at mental health, like depression, anxiety. These are, and then burnout. So it gets into the extent to which people are emotionally exhausted, cynical. All right, some people say burnout and mental health are the same thing. There's some debate about that, but we separated them. And so, of course, fairness and health are correlated with all. Fairness is correlated with all these types of health and all types of fairness. It's not as strongly correlated with physical health as you would imagine, because physical health is a lot more, has a number of other determinants, and this is a perceptual variable. But it's interesting that there's been multiple studies that have found a link between fair treatment and heart attacks. Actually, if they follow people over time, and deaths due to heart attacks. One of the first studies was done in Scandinavia in this area. So there's some interesting linkages there, and this has been replicated. But again, burnout, mental health seem to be correlated as well with fairness. Not surprising, but one of the things I was interested in, well, what are the explanations for this? And one explanation is that people who are treated unfairly, they don't take care of themselves, maybe. Their health behavior is not as functional. The other is the emotions that people experience. So maybe, as Dr. Camphor was saying, maybe it's something to do with the anger, the negative emotions that people experience, and that when this happens frequently over time, this leads to health problems. So we looked at these sort of mechanisms, and you find clearly that the emotions seem to be the stronger factor. We separated emotions from stress, but you see basically that health behavior is very weakly related to fair treatment, whereas stress and negative emotions are strong outcomes. And so I started to think about why this would be. So obviously this is evidence from lots of studies that fair treatment and the distributed, procedural, interactional justice, like contract violation, these are all associated with mental health problems, physical health problems, more strongly with mental health problems. And so I was very interested in why this is, right? Fundamentally. I was thinking about this, I was like, in some level, none of us should really be stressed when you compare ourselves to like hunters and gatherers or people around the world that are very poor. They actually have real stuff to worry about, right? They got to feed themselves, and they got real threats to their vitality. And yet we still get stressed about things, and I think some of it has to do with the role of moral judgment in what happens to us. And so I think with respect to equity, with respect to some of these other things, and so that's where I started to get more interested. Okay. So again, if you start thinking about why things stress people out at work, as I said before, workload, control are the two of the most prominent factors that people look at. But I was interested in, to what extent is it the work that causes stress, the conditions themselves, or is it that these things violate what people think they're entitled to or what's appropriate? And so that's a question that I started to look at. There's research saying that deviations from expectations trigger sense-making. When something happens to us and it deviates from what we expect, we try to make sense of it, right? And then we make a judgment about it. So that's what led me to this next paper. So one way to look at this was to look at the norms of an occupation. So was an occupation, so if I'm in an occupation that's supposed to be demanding or supposed to be autonomous, all right, does that affect my reaction to those conditions beyond the conditions themselves? So we did this. We looked at what's called, I don't know if anybody's familiar with ONET. Some of you are probably familiar with this, but this has ratings for an occupation. So a professor, for example, will get rated very highly on autonomy, for example, whereas, say, cashier or something would not. Right? Just on generally, those certain occupations are higher and lower on workload and autonomy on average. And so we looked at 3 large samples, basically, and looked at whether deviations predicted well-being beyond just the conditions themselves. Okay, so those are the samples. These are large samples. And we applied this regression technique some of you may be familiar with, where the math is actually not very complicated, but basically it allows you to look at the congruence basically as an important factor in the effect of a particular variable. So in this case, you looked at, for example, job pressure and autonomy, which are on the right-hand side of this 3-dimensional presentation here, and then you have the occupation on the left-hand side. In this case, it's job satisfaction is the outcome, and if you look at higher is higher in job satisfaction, and as you can see there is, and if it makes sense, there is a very strong effect of congruence here. If we look at especially autonomy on the right there, you can see for people whose occupation tends to be very autonomous. Autonomy is a very strong factor in their job satisfaction, whereas if you look at people on the low end of autonomy, you see that there's a much weaker effect. And in fact, really the job satisfaction seems to go down when autonomy is lower than you would expect given the occupation that people have. We get something similar with job pressure, although it's not quite as strong. We also looked at depression. So you get the same thing with autonomy and predicting depression. You see depression tends to be lowest when autonomy is a little bit higher than you would expect given the occupation. You also see that the pressure or the workload of the job, which is a sort of index, right, again, that tends to be lowest when it's congruent with the occupation, not perfectly, but there's something going on here that suggests that it's not just the conditions themselves, it's whether they deviate from what people think is appropriate or what you would expect given the occupation. All right. This was predicting perceived support. So if you look at the pressure people experience, again, when it exceeds what you would expect given the occupation, in this case the pressure that people are under, we call it criticality, you see this big drop off in the perceived supportiveness. All right. So it suggests again that there's something beyond just the conditions themselves. We did the same thing with depressive symptoms to replicate this in another study, and we found again the same effects. These are in two different other samples just to show I like replication, and so it was nice to see that we get the same effect, in fact even a little bit stronger in a second sample, or two other samples. Okay. Finally, the last thing is we looked at psych contract violation as an outcome and as an explanation. And once again, we get the same effect. Basically, when workload exceeds what you would expect, which seems appropriate for the occupation, that you get this jump in psych contract violation, right? That the employees in that case tend to view that their organization has violated what is appropriate. So what do I take from this? At least, and I'm exaggerating it maybe a little bit, but the working conditions that people have are maybe less important than fairness, equity, respect, and the extent to which people make sense of them and feel that they're appropriate or not. And it appears that people seem to blame or credit the organization when their working conditions deviate from fairly objective norms. Right? These standards at the occupational level are fairly objective. Okay, so now we have links between fairness and well-being. That brings me to my next area of interest, which is in why more fundamentally, and that's what got me interested in the moral emotions. So the moral emotions at work, right? These things like anger that Dr. Canfer talked about, right? Some have argued these underpin moral judgment. So people go throughout their day at work and they make judgments about what's happening to them. And some of these, I suspect, are very automatic and they're highly emotionally laden. Perhaps through learning how that happens, I don't know exactly, but people have argued that these judgments are very affect laden when people judge what happens to them. So if we think back to the framework, what falls in the moral domain, what should trigger these emotions? Moral emotions are interesting. They're triggered by events that fall in the moral domain. They also tend to elicit justice restoring behavior, meaning that they elicit the desire to reciprocate either negatively or positively in some way to sort of reconcile the situation and fulfill sort of this sense of justice or morality that people have. So things that fall within the moral domain should trigger these emotions. I was also interested in the positive side of this as well, so we tend to focus on the negative, but the positive is also interesting and actually may be very powerful as well. The other thing is these should be triggered mostly by intentional actions, right? So the actions that are attributed to be on purpose or trying to do something. That's something we'll come back to at the end. So what are the moral emotions, all right, that I was interested in? So we took a look at these four moral emotions at work. Namely anger, right? Anger is an approach emotion that people have. Usually elicits a desire to correct a situation. You could look at it as a stress response to a threat to moral goals. Contempt is also another negative emotion, a little bit different in the sense that this tends to trigger more of an avoidance response. It usually is it's kind of like a disgusted feeling that people have sometimes when something is done incorrectly. Then a positive side is also interested in things that trigger gratitude at work. So gratitude is a sense of thankfulness when something is given to us that maybe we feel it goes beyond what we're entitled to. And then admiration is more the observation of somebody else doing something good or commendable. And so you also have other types of moral emotions that are directed toward the recipient, like sympathy, empathic distress. I'm not focusing on those here, but some people include those in the moral emotions. Okay. Oops, I go the wrong direction here. So we did a critical incident study. We looked at 423 full-time workers, and we just asked them to provide an experience that triggered each of these emotions. We had 1,304 incidents to code. All right, lots of time went into this. The most amazing thing was very unpredictable to me, actually. You probably saw it very quickly, but you would never guess what the I've never had anybody guess what the most common thing that people reported as causing anger. But it was very clear, it was poor coworker performance. Especially when a coworker does something, it creates more work for you, and the organization doesn't do anything about it. All right, this is a very tricky situation for organizations. Right? This is one of the worst things organizations have to deal with is poor performers. And this is, of course, in the eye of the beholder. Right? Who knows, people are biased too. All right, but this was the most common anger-inducing incident. I think it was interesting because in some cases it's harmful to other coworkers, or it's perceived to be, and also is perceived to be unfair. And sometimes it's perceived to be disloyal. So it hits on a lot of those different moral emotions, or I should say moral factors. Undesirable task situations, so it goes back to the idea of having more work than you feel you were supposed to get. So task situations, or you've been put in a situation that seems inappropriate. Right, this triggers anger. Coworker interpersonal situations, supervisor support. All right, these are big things. And supervisor incompetence. So a lot of people, or I shouldn't say a lot, but a certain percentage reported being angry at the supervisor being in some way incompetent. What did people do in response to this? Some people said they confronted the person. This was the most common response. So I told her what happened to make sure it would not happen again. Some people complained to management. Other responses, they might avoid the person. They try to control their emotions. Some people talk about they bite their tongue, things like that. Some people say they went home and drank more or whatever. Some people said they withdrew efforts, complained, they tried to fix the situation. So all of these are things that they're either trying to restore justice to the situation, or they're trying to cope in some other way with their emotion. What about gratitude? So this was kind of interesting. The most common thing was getting so this was sort of the first time we talked about the positive side, but getting some kind of recognition, especially if it wasn't, well, I shouldn't say especially, but it was common that people reported getting recognition for their work, even if they didn't get any reward from it. So being thanked for it, being told they did a good job. This was the most common thing people reported as triggering gratitude. Support from coworkers or subordinates. All right, so this was being helped by a coworker or subordinate, getting pay, base recognition, as you would imagine. Interactions with beneficiaries. So this is where people interact with, for example, students or customers, and they say this is gratifying to have the opportunity to help people or to do a good job. Desirable tasks, so getting tasks that they like to do, and then benefits. Some people would actually report, the policy that their organization had. What do people do in response to this? Some people say thanks, some people increase their efforts, some people reciprocate in other ways, and then sometimes they'd say spend more time with a person, do something nice for others, savor the emotion. All right, so these are all things that happen, these can happen regularly for people, all right, in everyday life. And so that was something that I got out of this. Contempt was an interesting one. I'll just briefly mention that. It was very similar to anger in terms of the types of things that cause contempt, but it was more commonly associated with counterproductive behavior. When people reported contempt, they're also less likely to say they confronted the person. They're more likely to just avoid that person if they could, right, and try to avoid the situation and just complain in general to other people. Right? And then finally, when we talk about admiration, this is something that's very rarely studied, actually, as far as I've seen in organizational science. But when people observe somebody else doing something very good, whether it's moral excellence, or if they observe somebody else helping somebody, or somebody else working hard, doing a good job, they find this very inspirational. Sometimes they praise the person. Sometimes they try to copy the person. A lot of people reported increasing their effort in response to an admiration-inducing incident. So So what do we get out of this then? Moral emotions seem to play an important role in the employee-organization relationship. It increases reciprocation. People copy or emulate the actors. It also triggers these justice restoration responses in workers. It also, many of the things people talk about are organization-wide practices are implicated in. So HR practices, working conditions, pay recognition, dealing with poor performers. All these things seem to factor into these moral emotions, which, at least as people report, are very powerful in triggering effort and all these different things. Okay, what are we doing here? All right, I'm going to skip this part because I want to move forward. So the next thing I was interested in is more quantitatively measuring these emotions. So I'll just talk about this briefly, and then I'll get to some of the sort of explanations that people come up with, which I think are interesting. Okay. So I said, well, we need to try to look at this quantitatively, right? To what extent do people direct their anger, gratitude toward their employers on a daily basis? And so I tried to think of, and one of the things that, as Dr. Weiss, who's a professor here, has written about quite well, is that emotions, these moral emotions and other emotions that people experience, but these in particular, they're subject to change on a daily basis. So they're not static. People aren't always angry all the time. So we decided to look at both sort of the chronic and the stable component of these emotions that people experience. So chronic and anger and gratitude is what we focused on toward the employer. And I said these would be subject to stable beliefs about the employer, right, that people have. And this is going to influence sort of the baseline level of these emotions that people experience, at least theoretically anyway. And then on the other hand, you have a sort of episodic gratitude and anger. So episodic gratitude and anger, these would be driven by events. So daily treatment from people in the organization is particular, things that fluctuate on a daily basis. So we looked at this more quantitatively. And again, the idea is that anger and gratitude, again, this hypothetical, you have sort of this baseline level, right, that's driven by stable beliefs. Now, I'm going to focus on perceived organizational support, the extent to which people believe the organization cares about them. But then it also fluctuates based on the action or interactions with agents, at least from the perception of the employee. Okay. And this is just, hypothetical week that could occur. All right, so in this study, we looked at 54 participants, 10 consecutive days. So we had about 501 daily surveys. We took daily measures of anger and gratitude. We also measured general emotions, how they felt that day generally. We measured interpersonal justice, so linking this back into fair treatment. We also measured the other dimensions of fairness, but I won't focus on them here. Helping from the supervisor. So this gets at that positive, the help side of the help-harm. And then citizenship toward the organization, counterproductive behavior toward the organization. Did people reciprocate in some way? Okay. So the one thing that stuck out in these quantitatively was trying to look at the stability of these emotions. It was interesting that compared to general emotions, moral emotions seem to be more stable, at least when directed at their employer. All right, so if you look at general negative and positive emotions, these are just are people who feel happy or sad. These seem to, this number, this is an ICC, it just reflects the stability basically in the emotion. And we find that, again, anger and gratitude are more stable than negative and positive affect. This suggests that to some degree it's people's moral emotions toward the organization. Some of this is dispositional, there's no question. And some of it is probably driven by the stable beliefs about the employer as well, which may also be partly dispositional. I mean, we can't tease that out here because we can't experiment on this. But again, this is kind of interesting. At the same time, it suggests that these emotions do vary and they also are stable in sort of equal levels. So these are just looking at the basic effects. Nothing surprising here, but we find that perceived support from the organization, this belief about the organization, right, this predicts both chronic anger and chronic gratitude, and then chronic levels of citizenship, at least as people report. Right, this is triggered by gratitude, and so you get this effect, perceived support to citizenship through gratitude. So gratitude maybe fosters reciprocation as an emotion. If we look at the daily experiences, we see the supervisor interpersonal justice. So are people treated with respect or not? Right? This negatively relates to anger. So if you flip it around, disrespect leads to anger, which leads to or is associated with counterproductive behavior on a daily basis. Helping behavior is associated with gratitude. So getting help from the supervisor is related to people feeling grateful toward the organization. This in turn is related to citizenship on a daily level. And so what you see here is some differentiation in the things that are triggered by anger and gratitude. In particular, interpersonal justice, fair treatment, at least in terms of interpersonal respect. This seems to be implicated in whether people feel angry or not, whereas helping seems to trigger whether people feel grateful or not. So there seems to be some distinction here. You can see here where maybe people feel angry and grateful at the same time, perhaps if you get some constellation of these. But again, this generalized belief about the organizations also seems to factor in. Okay, so this further supports the role of moral emotions in the relationship between employees and their employers. These emotions, at least if you ask people, they make sense to them to indicate how angry or grateful they are toward their employers. And it suggests that these they seem to be 50% variable on a day-to-day basis based on events, and 50% or so it seems to be chronic. We also start differentiating the anger and gratitude antecedents. So anger seems to be triggered more by harmful or disrespectful activity. Gratitude triggered more by help. All right. If you have neither of these, an employee may feel no moral emotion at all. They may just, their emotions are maybe triggered by other things. And again, we find here that anger and gratitude are distinct from general affect. So this was something that reviewers always bring up, as well as this just negative or positive affect. All right, there's clearly was a distinction in multiple ways we looked at it, whether you looked at the factor analysis or you look at the way it functions in these reciprocation. All right, this clearly was empirically distinct, at least, in what people were reporting. So there had been very little research done on anger and gratitude quantitatively. This was one of the first ones that we were aware of, especially on a daily basis. Okay. So where are we at? We have fairness as a relatively strong predictor of work-related stress, psychological well-being. Sense-making seems to guide reactions to working conditions, how people make sense. And moral emotions, these occur regularly in response to events that occur on a daily basis, events that are maybe even sort of ordinary in terms of their occurrence. And they may have a functional role in both stress the employee experiences. You could even look at anger as a stress response because it's a mobilization of sort of energy in response to a violation of moral goals. And there are other causes of anger too, but this is arguably the most powerful. And then motivational processes as well. Motivation to reciprocate, the motivation to help the organization. Okay. Finally, I want to finish up and talk about explanations. I think these are really interesting. And this is going to raise some more questions, I think, for me than answers. But we've got some new data on this. I have not presented this to anybody yet, at least some of this, so it hasn't run through the gauntlet of peer review yet. So I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but we'll see. So I was very interested in people trying to explain the actions, the moral actions of others. As I said before, some have argued that mind perception, the perception of others' mental states and intentions, is essential to moral judgment, that people judge the actions of somebody else who is harmful at work or is helpful, in part based on what their intentions are. And so this forces us to start to think about, are people attributing these events to things that are internal or external? All right, that's a classic view of attributions. Or do you view somebody's behavior as a function of something inside of them, something immaterial, or do you view it as something external or purely physical? I mean, at some level, you could logically try to argue that everybody's actions are just atomic collisions and that sort of thing. But people don't think this way. People assign these mental states as causes and goals and things like that. And then other questions, are these stable or not? Do we believe that somebody does something immorally? Do we believe that's a stable reason? Is there a stable internal cause for that? Or is it something unstable? Is it temporary? Is it a temporary goal? So one of the things that, so I'm just going to talk about two things here. One is entitativity. So this is something that I think is an interesting wrinkle when we talk about organizations. So we generally look at morality is usually looked at with other individuals. Sometimes we look at organizations, but we don't think, there's not much research looking at the extent to which people actually view the organization as a singular entity. Or do they view it as just this collection of individuals? Entitativity refers to this sort of this sense of agency and homogeneity in the group, all right? Or at least that's what it reflects. All right, it's a sense of oneness. Do you view it as an entity or do you view it as this loose collection? All right, we tend to view other human beings as entities with agency. When somebody punches somebody else, we don't say their arm punches them, we say they punched somebody else, right? But do we view the organization this way? Do we say the organization did this to me, or do we say that somebody did this to me, or do we say that this policy caused this, or something like that? I argued that this influences the perceived collective intentions of organizational behavior that helps or harms the employee. And that this also amplifies the sort of valence of what is happening to people, and amplifies the valence, meaning how good or bad people view the organization to be when it's entitative. There's some interesting other research suggesting that when people view an outgroup as entitative, they distrust them more. Right? But if people identify with a group and they also view it as entitative, this has benefits. Right? But again, not much research has been done on this with respect to the employee-organization relationship. So this is very quickly, we did a measure study. I'm not going to talk about this because I want to move to but basically we provided some evidence for the validity of the measure of entitativity that exists. I'm happy to talk about it later. So one of the questions I had is the extent to which employees reciprocate how they are treated toward the organization contingent on how entitative they perceive the organization to be. So if my supervisor or coworker helps me or is uncivil to me, do I respond with anger toward my whole organization or gratitude toward my whole organization? And is that dependent on whether I view that organization as an entity? If my supervisor does something, do I view that as my organization is doing something? If my coworkers do something, do I view that as my organization? Or do I write that off as, no, that's just that person doing this, or that's just this policy, or is this something else? So we did this, we looked at entitativity at 101 South Korean workers. A colleague thankfully collected these. We were involved in this, designing it. He was able to collect data from 101 workers. So we measured entitativity, we measured once, and we also measured daily helping and civility, anger, gratitude. We also measured perceived support from the organization generally. We also got supervisor ratings. First thing was useful to know that if we looked at supervisor ratings of performance, all right, we find that gratitude and perceived support from the organization predicted extra role performance. They predicted innovative performance as rated by the supervisor. Anger tended to predict in-role performance or task performance, at least significantly. So at least this provided some more validity for these emotions as predictors of behavior intended to help the organization from a non-self-reported source. Okay. More interesting was whether entitativity moderated the effect of helping and incivility from agents of the organization on emotions toward the organization, on these moral emotions. And I did find this. So this was just looking at coworker helping, so whether they received helping from coworkers. And we find that this contributes more to gratitude toward the organization when they view it as entitative. All right, so that's that orange line there, high entitativity. All right, I hate trying to spell it out. I can never spell it. I can never say it half the time. It always gets a squiggly line, so Google apparently doesn't have entitativity in its dictionary yet. So maybe if I type it enough times, it'll get in there. But anyway, entitativity, helping, again, predicts, so people are more likely to experience an emotion toward the organization based on how they're treated when they view the group as entitative or not, when they view the group as entitative. We find the same thing with anger and incivility. So this is from the supervisor. You also get the same effect with supervisor helping and gratitude. All right. But here again, it's even stronger interaction. So this is predicting daily fluctuation in anger. It seems to fluctuate more strongly with incivility when the organization is viewed as entitative, meaning, do people view the organization as this singular entity, or do they view it as, again, this loose collection? Right. And then finally, you looked at POS as well. So again, the whole idea of that's perceived organizational support. So if people perceive the organization as supportive, does that predict performance? Again, we find the same thing. Entitativity seems to moderate the effect of perceived support on performance. In some level, the perceived organizational support only makes sense if people view it as an entity. Otherwise, it really is a meaningless construct. And so we kind of find that here as well, that entitativity may be a factor on which employee-organization relationships are contingent. Okay. All right, so that is factors, and some of the explanations that people are coming up with maybe for what's happening to them, maybe to some degree contingent on how entitative the organization is. So the last thing I want to talk about, and this is very recent, hopefully it makes sense, but so the last thing I was interested in is this idea of collective intentions. And so do people view what's happening from this, follows from the last study, but do people view what happens to them as intentional on behalf, and do they view it as on behalf of the organization? Do they view the organization's trying to do something? And so this led me to start to think about how people view intentions. And so there's some very interesting work, and I'm still learning about it, by this guy Bertram Molley up at Brown. And he talks about this full concept of intentionality. And this is the idea that people develop theories about the behavior of others. All right, these aren't very well constructed theories unless maybe you're a psychologist. But everybody does this, right? And they develop basically about actions and intentions of others. And there are three types of explanations or factors that people use to explain intentions of others. One is we explain them based on the beliefs of others. So if somebody, again, if a supervisor, well, I got an example in the next slide, but if somebody does something you may think it's because they believe it's going to get something meaningful to them or important to them, right? That's a belief, right? That's this expectancy that you're ascribing to somebody else. It may also be the goals that you think the other person has when they do something. So somebody else may be trying to do something in order to get something out of you, or they're trying to hurt you, or trying to help you, and so on. And then there's also what he calls this causal history or reason. Sometimes people come up with explanations for the behavior of others based on the circumstances. And one of those circumstances is very common are characteristics of the actor. So sometimes we say, why did so-and-so not show up? Well, they're lazy, right? And so you might say, well, they're lazy. That infers that they don't care about the goal of showing up on time. And so, but the causal history of reason is where we are sort of assigning some dispositional explanation, at least in most cases that I've seen in the data that we had. And then you also have this issue of collectives. So again, are collectives or organizations treated as jointly acting groups like humans? Do we perceive the organization to have these things as well? Does the organization have goals? Does the organization have beliefs in the employee's mind? Does the organization have characteristics that trigger them? So for example, being treated harmfully. All right, you might have a belief or goal explanation. My supervisor organization may be trying to get me to work harder, and they think that decreasing my pay will motivate me. That could be a belief that you ascribe, and also ascribe some kind of goal that they have, right? And there are various types of goals, as we'll see. There's this causal history of reason. So my organization doesn't care about my well-being, or it has a poor relationship with me, right? That's sort of this circumstantial feature of the organization, right? And then people sometimes will explain what happens to them based on something like, with this kind of explanation. Sometimes they use these enabling factors. These are what others would call external factors. So maybe the person didn't have the ability to act in a different way, or the organization doesn't have the resources. So these are all different explanations that people have, and I think these also play an important role in the moral emotions that people experience, and also the moral judgment that people place. All right. So last study here, 166 participants. People reported on one helpful, one harmful incident. And then they also reported on why they thought this happened. This is at work, that is. We also measured entitativity. We measured perceived organizational support. All right, so perceived organizational support is basically a causal history of reason. In a way, it could be an explanation, right? Because some people would explain what happens to them. My organization cares about me, and that's why they did it. All right, so that even factors in. But we measured that as well explicitly. There's that. All right. I've learned about that earlier today. Okay. All right, so what were the goal explanations that people came up with for helpful incidents? Sometimes people said, I got helped because the organization's trying to increase their profits or performance. So this is a very cynical explanation, all right? They're trying to keep their employees motivated to get their work done for them. Sometimes those employee relations, so sometimes they're just trying to avoid conflict. I think this happened because I complained about it. So sometimes people assign this goal. They say the organization harmed me because basically it was motivated by some relational factor, or it could be a helpful incident as well. They're trying to help me, or I should say they're just trying to keep relations good. Sometimes it was well-being. I think management was very considerate and took careful notice of my concerns. All right, this was an example. So sometimes people explain it by saying the organization was actually trying to improve their well-being. Right? So that's a different explanation. Sometimes they said that the organization was trying to do the right thing or be fair. Right? So they'd say they did, people would say, I got a raise because I deserved it. Right? They told me it was because I'm a hard worker and they wanted to show their appreciation for me. So this is more being moral, fair, reciprocating. And then sometimes it was just compliance. Sometimes people said they received help because the breaks are mandatory and management had forgotten, ignored my request, right? That's sort of a compliance explanation. So these are different goals that people assign to helpful incidents, which presumably fall in the moral domain, but I think you get very different reactions depending on the explanations people come up with. You also have causal history reason explanations, positive moral attributes. I think this was done because they liked me and value my work. I believe they have a wonderful team who's fully supportive of each other. Right, so these are explanations that are based on the characteristics of the group or the people acting. Sometimes it's the relationship, right? So I had family connections that also helped this happen. I worked for a partner in that firm, and having a work experience with him led to him putting in a good word for me. So these are things like, ooh, all right. So these characteristics of the relationship, these are things that they assume because they have a good relationship with the other person that they're trying to, that's why they're helping them. They're helping them either to maintain the relationship or they're inferring some other goal as a result of that. Okay. Harmful incidents, you get some of the same ones. You also get, sometimes people attribute it to self-politics, so selfish goals. Right, I'm not going to go through all of these here, but sometimes people also attributed it to being fair or moral, so sometimes people were harmed. They'd say, well, yeah, maybe I deserve this, or because I didn't perform well. Sometimes it was due to compliance. So they assigned a lot of the same goals to the harmful and helpful incidents, but they trigger different reactions. Okay. And then finally, sometimes the harmful incidents, people attribute this to harmful characteristics of the organization, or immoral characteristics, right? The owner is a cheap, rich piece of whatever. That's what somebody wrote, so I don't swear in talks. But they're hungry and greedy. They have no regard for the lives of their employees when it comes to making a profit. So these are assigning characteristics to the organization as the explanation for why something happened, right? And then again, characteristics of the relationship. So these are usually situations where people said, well, they don't like me or they don't know me very well, and that's why they did this, right? And that's and then they're assuming again that this influences the goals of the actor. Okay. And then finally, enabling factors. So sometimes people would say, well, this happened because the organization had to do it, or they didn't have the resources to give me to give me the hours I needed, things like that. All right. So the most common explanations for helpful incidents. So usually they attributed goal explanations. Morality, fairness goals were most common. Maximizing performance and profits was also very common. And then finally, improving employee well-being and need fulfillment. All right, so these goals, when people thought the organization was trying to accomplish these goals, right? This was fairly common. And then you also have, less common were these sort of other explanations. My organization's good, supportive, cares about me, right? That sounds a lot like perceived support. And then the relationship with the employer. So this was the order in which these explanations appeared. The harmful explanations, by far the most common, were they were trying to maximize profit goals. And they also, people often gave the organization credit for the situation, maybe made things difficult for them. So trying to make sense of this and bring this together, I started to look at, well, to what extent are these viewed as intentional on behalf of the organization? And what types of explanations are seen as more intentional? And does this relate to entitativity again in POS? And this is sort of where I finished up. So when we looked at I looked at these reasons, and I categorized them into moral or amoral reasons in terms of the helpful incident. So basically, was the organization good or trying to do something good or fair, or did they help me for some other reason? And we looked at whether this influenced the extent to which it was perceived as intentional. They looked at the extent to which we looked at whether it was related to whether people perceive the organization as supportive and entitative. And you see here, when people perceive the organization as entitative and supportive, they tended to give them credit for what happened to them. They tended to attribute it to positive moral goals. Right? When they didn't view them as entitative or supportive, they tended to view this as less intentional. And so as well, and they attributed less to moral goals. Okay. And in terms of harmful incidents, we looked at whether they were trying to maximize profits, whether there were immoral characteristics of the organization, characteristics of the relationship, or enabling factors. The main thing here is that basically if people said that they were trying to maximize profits, all right, that they viewed it as more, the harmful incident as more intentional. If they viewed it as, these attributions, basically when people attributed a harmful incident to a sort of immoral goal of the organization, they viewed it as more intentional, basically. So these intentionality judgments seem to be closely related to the attributions that people come up with. So, the last thing is I looked at the intentionality. So we found that basically entitativity predicted intentionality of helpful incidents, which in turn predicted citizenship in response to help. So the more entitative the organization was viewed, the more helpful more intentional that it was perceived to be, and the more likely people were to engage in citizenship. And then if we looked at the negative side, perceived support from the organization, the extent to which the organization is seen as supportive, that led people to think that the harmful incidents were less intentional. Entitativity led people to think of them as more intentional. So entitativity seems to increase intentionality judgments of the organization. Perceived support seems to influence the extent to which people perceive the organization as doing harmful things unintentionally. They're less likely to blame them for them. And that in turn leads to is predictive of counterproductive behavior. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. So what does it all suggest? One, POS, entitativity, these influence explanations that people make for what is happening to them. When they view the organization as entitative or supportive, right, this influences the moral explanations that people have for helpful and harmful events. In some explanations, they focus on specific goals of the organization. Some focus on individuals within the organization. Some focus on characteristics of the organization at large. And some focus on characteristics of the relationship with the organization. Okay. All right, so stepping back, general conclusions here. As we look back here, morality seems to have a central role in employee well-being and motivation. All right, moral goals are very important to people. They reflect things they are implicated in things that happen in everyday life at work. People develop descriptive views of collective entities. They develop emotions toward them. They develop views about their goals. And these influence the explanations that people make for what happens to them. So it's very powerful factor potentially. This may be why they have a powerful effect or association at least with performance and with well-being. Workers hold theories for why things are happening to them. They develop these explanations and they can vary quite considerably. And again, these explanations are affected by characteristics they view. They assign mental states and goals to collectives. And these perceived intentions, I argue, are critical in the moral judgments that people have. All right, future things I'm kind of interested in. I'm interested in the dimensions of entitativity, so heterogeneity. So do people view the organization as diverse, a diverse set of opinions, or do they view it as very homogeneous and cohesive? And I'm interested in whether these dimensions differentially predict reciprocation, collective responsibility. Agency, to what extent do people view the organization as capable of acting intentionally? And I believe this affects intentionality, the collective intentionality of things that happen. I'm curious about, and I'm sure there's some literature on this, at least that touches on this in other areas, but I'm interested in how people view other outgroups or institutions or organizations or collectives. Scientists behind AI and machines, for example, do people trust them? Do people trust organizations? Do they trust the media, right? In general, at large? And so these other groups, are also, and do people ascribe mental states to these other collectives as well? Does this explain some of the distrust that people have? It's very important for our democracy that people do trust institutions to some degree. And also, do people assign entitativity and moral responsibility to other non-human agents? Self-driving cars is a big topic these days. So that, and other sort of AI, robotics type things. So there's some interesting stuff on that. So that's all I have. Thank you for your time. I enjoyed it. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, and if anybody has any, or thoughts, or comments, suggestions, criticisms, anything. Yes, sir.
Were you surprised at any of these results?
I was surprised at looking at the types of things that cause anger. I was surprised at that. I was surprised at how often people reported poor coworker performance as a cause of anger. I wasn't expecting that. In retrospect, it makes sense, but that was probably the most surprising thing I saw. I guess that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think when I first looked at some of their research on fairness and health, I was surprised to find that fairness was related to physical health the way it was. At least to some degree, so those are some things that surprised me. In retrospect, you can explain them, I think, but yeah, they surprised me. Yeah.
Well, if you were asked by a corporation or some entity within a corporation to help design their climate, as it were, what kinds of things would you be telling them on the basis of this work?
So the question was, if I was talking to an organization, what would I tell them to promote a positive climate based on this work? I think I would go back to the critical incidents, give us a lot of information about the types of things that people appreciate. So again, recognizing work that people, good work. That was certainly the one thing that came up a lot. Certainly, so avoid, I guess, dealing with poor performers in a constructive way, and that's a very challenging thing to do. It's not something anybody likes, but the cost of not doing that is toxic. So that would be another one. Certainly, obviously, any kind of pay-based recognition that people can get. Those are things. Generally, I would say too, making morality or ethics a priority. Not only is it important for legality purposes, but it's also important for people feeling good about what they're doing and who they're around. Because again, not only does it trigger the positive emotions, but it's probably contagious to some degree. Also, fair procedures. Some of this goes back to the fundamentals of organizational fairness. So having a fair process through which decisions are made that's somewhat transparent. Obviously, you can't be, you can't involve everybody in every decision, so there's a balance there. But this is probably the most powerful of the fairness predictors of actually employee emotions and attitudes is procedural fairness. So those are some things that certainly come to mind. And there's some other stuff too that came up in the critical incidents that I could go back to. So does that make sense? Or, yep. What else? Yes, sir.
So I was surprised by your finding that one of the most, or maybe it was the most common response to the anger-inducing incidents was confronting the other person.
Yes.
And that list you showed of what were the most common anger-inducing incidents also included a couple that were lower on the list
Yes.
around supervisor behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And HR departments and managers of people spend a lot of time trying to help or train individual workers to have the courage. In fact, sometimes the workshops are called things like courageous conversations or fierce accountability, to have get up the nerve to be able to deal directly with a coworker around issues that concern them. So I think that's interesting, and you may not have these data points right at hand, but my question I'd love to know is, what was the connection there? Was it the confronting the other person? How closely was that matched with the poor coworker performance as an anger-inducing? You know what I mean?
Okay.
In other words,
yeah.
in sort of regular organizational everyday life, I think it's very common for individuals to go to their supervisor.
Yeah.
But not necessarily to the individual. And I think that would have real implications for management training in corporations, organizations, and HR. How much people are doing that already, feeling comfortable with it, versus needing to do that more.
So to get the question, I know that one of the things we found is that people were more likely to confront the source when it was a coworker or somebody that was lateral or below the person in terms of the hierarchy. They were less likely to confront the supervisor. So it seems like the power differential affected those actions. Excuse me. So I would say that, at least from the data, that people were more likely to confront a coworker, when something was happening. I can't remember specifically about the poor coworker performance, but I know that was one common response. They go and say something to them about it. So, in terms of, and so did you have a follow-up? Were you asking about like what that means for HR or training or that sort of thing? Or
I just sort of wanted to probe into that a bit.
Yep.
I think it was an interesting point of yours that I think has a lot of relevance in workplaces.
Yes, yeah. So, and whether people do, and whether it's appropriate to confront others, I think, that may be something that ought to be brought into training as to how to deal with these sorts of situations. What's the best way, most functional way, whether it's confronting the other person. I know this comes up in sexual harassment training, obviously, that's probably the most salient, which is obviously a unique situation. But yeah, I think that's a really important thing is how people respond to anger. It's not studied very much actually in either, and so that was quite interesting. Yep. Yes.
So it seems to me like one of the theoretical kind of contexts of this is that there is a long-standing or at least stable relationship between the worker and the organization.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you know if there's any research out there on moral emotion and gig work. I mean, is that how that works at all?
No, I don't think there's any research on that. There's not much research on gig work in our field, at least, as you know. I think it would be interesting to see whether people, have how well-formed beliefs about their employers in those situations. I mean, at the same time, I could see an Uber driver, for example, having a very clear picture of, does Uber care about me or not? And so that's a causal history explanation actually for something that Uber does to them. And that's going to influence their explanations. If Uber cuts their pay or something like that, all right, they're going to think that they don't care about me. They're not going to think that, they had to because they're not making enough money. So I still think it's possible that gig workers have strong views of these sort of entities. Maybe it depends on whether there's a brand that they have. I think I was talking to one of the faculty earlier about how brands have people assign personality characteristics to brands. like Nike or things like that. And I know marketing gets into that a lot. So I suspect there may be some stuff on marketing and how people view these companies, but no research that I know of about that relationship from the perspective of the employee. Yep. So I think it's a really good question, though. Yep. Yes.
Do you feel like there's any sort of relationship between, particularly thinking about the critical incidents, with the negative emotions and some of the illegitimate task research that's being done?
Yeah. So and one of the more common incidents that came up was, work tasks, and yeah, I think it links closely to that. There's a lot of research, for some who aren't familiar, on illegitimate tasks. So people who are asked to do things that are maybe outside of their job description or seen as not part of their job, and it links a little bit into the work too on we looked at deviations from occupational norms, but yeah, that comes up in both the qualitative stuff, the critical incident study, and in the quantitative stuff too, when you compare workload to occupational norms or autonomy or that sort of thing. So I think it links closely to that, legitimate tasks. So it's not the tasks themselves, but their legitimacy, or whether they're seen as equitable. Yep, I think it relates directly to that. In fact, one of the reviewers for that paper talked about that theory when we submitted it. So yep, makes sense. Yes. Whoever wants to go. Here you go. You go. Okay.
This actually kind of on top of Sibley's question. So as I was watching this and seeing some of your examples, it seems like some of these are really referring to individuals in the organization as opposed to the organization itself. And one thing that kind of came to mind when you're talking about this is the factor of time.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the first time this happens, you attribute it to the person, but then if another person does it, and then another person does it, and another person does it, and now you're starting to use the organization.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to what extent did you did you explore anything like that, or did you explore anything like that?
Well, the one thing that we did look at, so we didn't have data on different people, but one thing I didn't talk about here, but I looked at the diary study. We looked at whether also looked at the supervisor in particular. If the supervisor did something helpful for the employee on a particular day, and we looked at whether that increased perceived supportiveness of the organization. So that would be something you wouldn't expect to change based on a single incident of help. And we found that basically one time, my supervisor does something for me today, I'm not going to change my view of the organization or at all. But we did find that if they received help that day and they received help on the past 5 or 10 days, that people did start to change their view of the organization. So if there was some consistency in the behavior, the treatment over time, that people did start to change perhaps their stable views, but it has to be consistent. It can't be just one time. And I think because people aren't going to attribute it to a stable internal goal of that the person or the organization has. So I would say that the consistency is important. But I would also, another thing I would theorize or hypothesize, but I don't have data on this, is that once people believe something about the organization or the person acting, if they say this person doesn't really care about me and they're just trying to get me to work hard, the people will tend to explain things that helpful acts by that, using that goal. So if I think my supervisor doesn't care about me and they help me, I'm going to think that they're just trying to get me to work harder. I'm not going to give them more credit for that. But if they're sacrificing that goal, I think is when for something else. So if the supervisor, even if they are trying to help me, but let's say the supervisor is doing something that they know is actually going to decrease my performance and it helps me anyway, then I think that might facilitate a change in the person's view. So if the organization or the person is perceived as sacrificing one thing for another, sacrificing profits or sacrificing something in favor of well-being, or vice versa, that would trigger a change. So I don't know if that makes sense, but so yeah, I think there's lots of things that you could certainly theorize about that too. So yeah. I think you had a question. Yes.
Yeah. So you made a really interesting point about entity and perceived organizations work. Is that if you don't believe the company's an entity, how do you believe that my company might support you?
Yes. Yeah.
Which I think is super valid. You looked at both, the direct effects of both of them on an outcome. I was wondering if you looked at them interacting, only if you think
they are an entity and they support you or the effects. And then also, like, I think there are really interesting implications of that. I don't know the measurements for perceived organizational support, but if you don't think your organization is an entity, then what are you rating?
Yes. So we did find that there was an interaction. So exactly what you're describing. So when the perceived supportiveness of the organization had zero or very little association with supervisor ratings of performance for people who didn't view the organization as entitative. It was only when the organization was viewed as entitative that the that performance was rated to be higher. So that would support what you're saying, that entitativity, which again gets to the broader issue, is that perceived organizational support as a construct, this is very widely measured. It's usually looked at as an antecedent or a moderator, something that is a contingency factor and some stressor. But I would argue it really doesn't mean much if people don't view the organization as an entity. I don't know what people are rating. So yeah, I think it's a contingency, I think. Yep. Now what factors into why people think of an organization as an entity is another issue. Is it the diversity of the organization? I think it has a, maybe, is it the perceived diversity in what characteristics? Is it the perceived cohesion? Is it perceived coordination? Does it seem to work well together in an intentional way? So I think those are all things that would factor into that. But yep. Very good. Somebody over here? Yes.
So either in your research or in the literature, did you come across anything that considered like locus of control or general submissiveness or power distance, things like that, and how a person might have moral emotions or sort of reactions or perceptions of fairness or immorality and stuff in an organization?
So, and what were you thinking of with respect to, so you're talking about just, what ties those together in your mind? Locus of control, power distance, yeah.
It actually relates back to what you said about moral emotions being stable.
Okay.
To me, I'm thinking like if somebody stably feels a certain way
Okay.
about an organization, not so reactive to certain events, it makes me think that's something that person might just be more likely to intrinsic or feel like the organization is intrinsically immoral, right? If it's a stable emotion, like, oh, I'm just kind of generally angry at the organization. It's like I would consider that maybe that person just tends to view it as a more external thing instead of like they would be willing to also then another time think, oh, well, that was actually my fault.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, so we didn't look at anything like like that in terms of the person's own propensity to explain things. Although I know there's some research on like hostile attribution as a bias. So some people do have a general tendency to attribute hostile intentions in others. And so we didn't look at that. It's probably something we should assess it, measure, and include. No, I think it's a good point. There's definitely a dispositional component to this. There's no question about it. And like I said, it does make me think of the hostile attribution bias as a factor. Some people just have this tendency to attribute the actions of others to negative intentions. And so I think that might factor into what you're saying. So if that makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
Yes?
Well, I think we have time for some questions informally
Okay.
at the reception. It is not going to be outdoors. It should be right out here, outside these doors. I want to thank you again and appreciate really enlightened.
Okay. Thanks for having me. Yep.